Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 7 for History 101. And today we're going to be talking about Maryland, the Pilgrims, and the Puritans. So last class we talked about Jamestown is where we left off. So since Jamestown, especially after it became a royal colony, became very successful, and that really opened up things for further colonization, both in the north and in the mid-Atlantic region. So we're going to stay in the same neck of the woods as your textbook does, and we're going to cover Maryland next, even though, as we'll find out, the Pilgrims came to New England in 1820. So there's some background information on how Maryland, comes into existence, and it all has to do with one person in particular, and that's Sir George Calvert. Sir George Calvert was the equivalent of the Secretary of State here in the United States. In England, that position is known as the Foreign Minister. He had been a very loyal servant to the government, the crown, and at this point in history, and we'll be getting into this a little bit more when we talk about the Pilgrims and the Puritans, but one thing that you'll remember from the past, the French and the Spanish, who are the two rival empires of the British, they're both Catholic empires. Now, the British are a Protestant empire. So besides there being this competition for nationalism and the might of the empire, there's also a religious competition going on between these empires. And in England, by this point, things have transformed to where there's the Church of England, or sometimes it's known as the Anglican Church, and that's the only religion you're really supposed to be a member of in England. And the one thing you're definitely not supposed to be is a Catholic. There's a lot of animosity between the English Protestants and Catholics everywhere, and you're certainly not supposed to be a Catholic in England. So, what happens here is Sir George Calvert, sort of out of the blue, makes a stunning announcement that he is a Catholic, always has been, and he's been hiding the fact for a long, long time. Now, this really stuns the Society of England from top to bottom. And obviously, after he, indicates his faith, which is not supposed to happen. And remember, he's a high-ranking member of the British government, being the foreign minister. He resigns his position, but there's a lot of people in England who are calling for his head. They want him beheaded as a traitor. So, Sir George Calvert had served his country loyally for a long time, so the crown will call him in and basically make him an offer that he can't refuse. They ask him, how would you like to have your own colony in North America? And the alternative was, sooner or later, he's probably going to be beheaded if he stayed in England. So, he certainly this is a pretty good offer. And what they're offering him is a proprietary colony. Now, we talked about the difference in those. So this would be a gift from the crown to Sir George Calvert of the colony of Maryland. And we're talking about the landmass that they're going to give him is 7 million acres. Now, the only real catch to it all, and it's not a catch for Sir George Calvert, they know he's not the only Catholic in England. There are other people hiding the fact. So they want him to bring every Catholic that he knows with him to start this colony, and it'll be a refuge for British Catholics. So it's sort of a win-win situation for the British government. They're going to establish another colony, and as you'll find out, they sort of get into the practice of exporting unwanted religions out of their country. So George Calvert agrees. He instantaneously becomes known as Lord Baltimore. And he and his Catholic followers and his family, his sons, all travel to Maryland to set up a proprietary profit-generating colony. Now, they have the advantage of doing this in 1630. Jamestown's been there since 1606, and they've sort of, I suppose you could say, worked out all the bugs. And immediately, Lord Baltimore, or Calvert, knows the key to success is the cultivation of tobacco. And even though Maryland's north of Virginia, it's still a fine climate for the cultivation of tobacco. It's not going to be as prized as Virginia tobacco, but it's pretty close. So he's going to set Maryland up like a feudal state from old European history. That's why he calls himself Lord Baltimore. He's sort of the lord of the manor. His sons will be given land plots, and they'll be lords. And most of the people that come there will sort of be like peasant farmers in the old feudalistic style. Maryland will be very quickly successful, and it will establish another prosperous colony for the British. Now, we'll get back to Maryland in a few minutes after we talk about some dealings they're going to have with the Puritans. So, the next thing we want to talk about, though, are the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims are a different religious group. And today we're going to be talking about the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So I'm going to explain to you what both of them are all about right now. Then we'll talk about the Puritans arriving in North America and establishing their colony. Then we'll talk about the Puritans doing the same. But first of all, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans are offshoots of the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, so they're Protestants. Now, Pilgrims are separatists. One belief that both the Pilgrims and the Puritans share is that they believe that the Church of England is being corrupted secretly by Catholics. Catholics are trying to infiltrate the Church of England and secretly sort of turn it into the Catholic Church. So, Pilgrims are separatists. They think that the Church of England's a lost cause. They want nothing more to do with it. They want to separate themselves from it. And as we'll find out, they want to leave England and have no part of it. On the other hand, the Puritans believe the same thing, that the Church of England's being corrupted by the Catholic Church, but they believe it can be fixed and repaired or saved. And they believe they're the ones to do it. Thus their name. They're the pure form of the Church of England, or Puritans. So they believe if people would just wake up in England, turn the Church of England over to them, they could turn it back into what it's supposed to be. So, they're willing to work with it, fix it, and so forth, where the Pilgrims want nothing more to do with it. So, the Pilgrims, what they're going to be up to here is the first way that they end up separating themselves and leaving England is they will not travel far. They will negotiate a deal through their leader. The leader of the Pilgrims is a man by the name of William Bradford. Bradford will cross the English Channel to the Netherlands, and he'll negotiate a deal with the Dutch government that will allow him to and the Pilgrims to leave England, move to the Netherlands, and live there. Now, one thing you need to know about the Dutch, they're very open-minded about religion in general. And since they're also a trade-based empire that's around the world, they have people from every religion you can think of living in the Netherlands. And they're very tolerant of that. So they more or less have the attitude of, more the merrier? Sure. Come on across the English Channel and move to the Netherlands. So the Pilgrims do. They'll live there for a few years, but pretty quickly they'll wear out their welcome. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the Pilgrims. Now, in graduate school, I had a graduate class on American colonial history. It was taught by Dr. Roger King. He's the same scholar that I mentioned in passing, not by name. When he was a graduate student at William and Mary, he helped his professor, transcribe those journals of those British explorers, and his professor he worked for put together that theory that the Roanoke colonists merged with the Chesapeakeans. He became an expert not only in colonial American history, but his real area of expertise, which he wrote several books about, was the Pilgrims and the Puritans. So in that class, we learned everything anybody would want to know about the Pilgrims and Puritans, and probably more, at least for my taste. But regardless, he's a highly respected expert in the area, so I'm going to tell you how he explained it to us in class, the difference between a Pilgrim and a Puritan. Explained to it in very similar fashion as I already have, that the Pilgrims were separatists and the Puritans were willing to work with the church and fix it. But then he went further and said the Pilgrims were fanatical, and that the best way to explain them is that they were, quote unquote, now these are Dr. King's words, they were the lunatic fringe of the Puritans, fanatical separatists. So with that in mind, even though they end up in a very tolerant place, the Netherlands, they wear their welcome out. Because sooner or later, they're preaching in the streets, telling other people from every religion you can imagine that more or less their religion is for the birds and that should really see the light and become a pilgrim. Now, that's not going to fly in the Netherlands. So sooner or later, they have to call in Bradford to the Dutch government and tell him, well, sorry, it just didn't work out. You've worn out your welcome. It's time for you and your followers to leave. So William Bradford travels back to England, meets with government officials, and he ends up working out a deal where he and the Pilgrims will get a charter issued to them to start, excuse me, a colony in North America in Virginia. Now, this is 1620. Now, Virginia is still controlled by the Virginia Company, but they're looking to expand, the British are. So what they're going to do is grant the Pilgrims a joint stock colony. Now, it's not going to be a typical joint stock colony. All the Pilgrims are going to pitch in their savings to pay for a ship, which you know is the Mayflower, and sail across the Atlantic, supposedly to Virginia, to start a colony. Now, it won't be a profit-bearing colony. It's going to be more like a communal colony of Pilgrims. They'll all share in the profits, so it's kind of like a joint stock, but it's not like they're looking to profit for a corporation. They're looking just to survive themselves and have as many Pilgrims there as they possibly can. So, British government grants them this charter. Now, let's think about it from the British government's perspective. The Pilgrims don't like them. They want to separate from them in the Church of England, the official government-sanctioned religion. The Pilgrims are kind of a pain in the butt. They don't want to be in England. England is just soon they weren't there. So here's the way the British government's looking at it. This is a win-win situation. We thought we had got rid of the Pilgrims when they moved to the Netherlands, but now they're back. So now if we give them this colony, they'll sail across the Atlantic. If they make it there, good. If they're lost at sea, oh well, we won't have to deal with them again. And if they create another viable colony, it's still under British government control, and we just expand our North American holdings. So it's a no-lose situation for the British government. So, as you know, the Pilgrims set sail in their famous boat, the Mayflower, for North America. Now, the Pilgrims, besides being separatists, unlike the Puritans, are not a very organized lot. They're going to leave at the wrong time of the year, and they're going to get blown way off course. Obviously, they're not going to end up in Virginia. They're going to end up at Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. So, they land in New England, in Massachusetts, and start trying to hack away their way into building a civilization out of the wilderness of New England. They get there way too late in the year to really get any land cleared and crops growing. And they didn't bring enough supplies with them. So in the first 6 months of their existence in New England, 50% of the original Pilgrims will starve to death. So it's a real struggle for them to survive. And had they not been assisted by Native Americans in the area, they wouldn't have survived. But this is where I also want to talk to you about a myth in American history, the myth of Thanksgiving. Now, I know as little kids, we were all taught that the Pilgrims and the Indians got along famously, and the Indians saved the day sometime around when Thanksgiving is, and appeared out of the forest and provided the Pilgrims with this giant feast where they all feasted on turkeys and whatnot. Now, that is not true. They got along with just a handful of Native Americans. Most of them they alienated because they didn't want anything to do with them unless they wanted to convert to the Pilgrim religion. One Indian in particular was very helpful to him, but he's not a typical Native American. His name was Squanto. Squanto had been captured and sold off into slavery in the Caribbean sometime before this by explorers. He had made his way back to his homeland, but he was very familiar with Europeans. So he got along with the Pilgrims, became their friend, and was kind of a conduit between the other Native Americans. Later on, there'll be all-out warfare between the Pilgrims and especially the Pequot Indians and others. So, the whole idea that Thanksgiving was about a whole bunch of Native Americans helping out the Pilgrims and they're all eating turkey together is a myth. Where it came from, I'm not quite sure. My theory is, and this would be a good topic for a master's thesis or whatever. I believe it all came out of advertising out of some Madison Avenue firm. They were probably hired by turkey growers at one point. And what better way to sell more turkeys in 1 week than the entire rest of the year than to have this romanticized idea of Native people helping the Pilgrims on a Thanksgiving Day feast. So let me also share with you, to back up my point about this myth, of when we had our very first Thanksgiving Day observance as a country. The president that declared it a day of Thanksgiving was Abraham Lincoln. And he did that in November of 1863, after two significant events had occurred during the Civil War. In July of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg took place, which most people didn't realize at the time was a turning point of the war, and that the North, who had been struggling and really losing the war up to that point, would now turn it around and win the thing. But people didn't realize that until later into 1864. Also, early in November, Abraham Lincoln had delivered the famous Gettysburg Address when he commemorated the National Cemetery at Gettysburg for the fallen heroes. After that, he declared that later on in the month, there would be a day of national thanksgiving in the Union for us to sort of regroup, be thankful for what we had and that we're still alive, and to move forward. It had absolutely nothing to do with turkeys, Indians, or Pilgrims. That was our very first Thanksgiving, and it carried on from that point forward. So, the one that we kind of study in preschool and so forth, that's a myth. I guess it's fun for kids to make little hats and, paper turkeys or whatnot. So, the Pilgrims will finally get their act together and survive. And one place that if you ever visit Massachusetts, especially if you're going to the Cape Cod region, don't waste your time going to Plymouth Rock. It's very unimpressive. It's not a very, when I visited, getting there in anticipation, I thought it was going to be this giant rock formation like the Rock of Gibraltar or something. They should call it Plymouth Pebble. I know people with larger boulders in their yards here in the Adirondacks than Plymouth Rock is. But very near Plymouth Rock is something very worth visiting. That's Plymouth Plantation. It's a completely reconstructed pilgrim village with some of the most accomplished reenactors who are there working on a daily basis, just like the Pilgrims would be, in period clothing, doing everything the way it was before, same sort of accents, and these people are experts, and it's a really great place to visit. And I would encourage any of you, if you make it over to the Cape Cod area, go to Plymouth Plantation. Now, on to the Puritans. At least let me get them to North America, then we'll talk about them shortly. Now, the Puritans, as I mentioned before, thought they were the pure form of the Church of England. So in 1630, after the Pilgrims had been up in New England and had been pretty successful after 10 years, decide they want to go to New England and join them. Because one of the stories that comes back about New England in general, its climate is pretty similar to England. Unlike Virginia and places further south, a lot of people couldn't hack the heat. It was much warmer, more humid, and New England was much more like England itself. That's why it's called New England, I suppose. But so they go to the British government, led by their very competent leader, John Winthrop, and he will negotiate a deal with the British government similar to the Pilgrim deal. They'll be granted a charter for a joint stock colony, and it'll be the same deal. They're not in it for profit. All the Puritans will chip their money in together, and it's, the whole existence of it is to make a bigger and better Puritan colony. Now, so in 1630, they'll set sail in a highly organized fashion, and they'll set sail early enough in the year in 1630 to arrive in time with their, ready to jump into action. As soon as they get to New England, they'll start immediately clearing land, planting crops, because they have all the equipment with them and they're ready to go. And they'll be able to have a harvest the first year. In the meantime, in their spare time, every able-bodied Puritan will be building buildings, homes for their families, a church, and so forth. They're a highly organized, hard-working group of people. And they'll obtain almost immediate success. And in fact, during the first year, 1630, more Puritans will follow. And by the end of the year, they've got a population of 2,000. Half of the Puritans aren't going to starve to death. None of them will. And within 10 years, the Puritan colony's population will rise to 16,000. They don't suffer the same sort of problems that the Jamestown colonists suffered. But a lot of it has to do where they settled. You don't have the diseases like malaria and yellow fever up in New England. You have plenty of clean drinking water in the inland lakes and so forth. So the Puritans will be very, very successful. Now, I'm going to call this lecture quits right now because I'm going to pick back up after I take a break. We're going to get into the Puritans in a lot more detail in that lecture. And we'll talk about some of their relationship with the Catholics down in Maryland also. So that's the end of this one. I'll be back shortly after I take a break, and we'll carry on with the Puritans. See you soon.